Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics, and in this video we're going to take a look at a handful of comics by Richard Sala. If you haven't seen my Richard Sala tribute, you can check out that video linked up here and in the description below. There are a handful of Richard Sala comics that I still haven't been able to get my hands on, and there is one more that's going to be published later in this year, 2020. Maybe it'll be pushed to 2021, I don't know. But I'm lucky to have gotten my hands on some, so in this video I'll give you a quick tour of what I've been able to pick up. Some of the earliest stories of Richard Sala that I have are included in the Drawn and Quarterly anthology. This is Drawn and Quarterly Volume 1, when it was a magazine-sized anthology collecting who's who of independent comics. Julie Doucette, Seth, Mary Fleener, Joe Matt, and Richard Sala. This is number 5 from June 1991. This is from earlier, number 3 from January 1991. And number 3 contains One of the Wonders of the World, a 2-page color piece by Richard Sala. Drawn and Quarterly number 5 obviously has a Richard Sala cover, as well as The Somnambulist, a 1-page story. Richard Sala was apparently not at all happy with the color reproduction of these stories, and if we look at his later work, we can see this looks rather muted, very different from the vibrant colors that I'm sure that he intended these comics to have. I love these anthology issues. I've got almost all of them, I think, because of the work by people like Mary Fleener and Seth that are also included in them. But from what I've read online, Richard Sala's dissatisfaction with the colors was one of the reasons why he switched to illustration for a long time, leaving comics only to return to it later. And also is one of the reasons why he embraced digital comics and online webcomics so much later in life, because he got what he really wanted from the colors in that medium in a way that these comics did not give him early on. He did tackle this dissatisfaction in a couple of different ways, with Dark Horse and Steve Niles working on the Little Book of Horror Dracula. You can see that the printing of this hardcover book allowed him to get the colors that I'm sure that he was looking for, and this is a fantastic adaptation, both in the writing but particularly in the wonderful artwork by Richard Sala, allowing this macabre adult story to be adapted really well without losing its creepiness for kids. There are 3 books in this Little Book of Horror Stories, and the other 2, I think Scott Morse is the artist of Frankenstein, and I don't remember who did War of the Worlds, but Dracula is definitely my favorite of the 3. He also worked on a black and white comic for Dark Horse Comics. This is 13 O'Clock, which contains 2 stories, 13 O'Clock and the Diabolical Dr. Q, 13 O'Clock itself being a multi-part short story. And this is a wonderful look at his early art style, scratchy and jagged, but full of pulp and mystery. This is a very handsomely produced comic with thick covers and very thick and glossy pages. The Ghastly Ones is not a comic, kind of like Dracula. It is prose illustrated, the prose being written and lettered by Richard Sala. Each section is illustrated with a little bit of rhyming text. And this reminded me of the Ghastly Crumb Tinies by Edward Gorey, with quite a lot of violence in its tongue-in-cheek humor. This is subtitled A Gallery of Gruesome Creeps by Richard Sala and published by Manic Press. A lot of the early stories of Richard Sala's that I don't have in their original format luckily were collected together in Maniac Killer Strikes Again, brought out by Fantagraphics after they'd started bringing out a number of his more recent books. So this was sort of a reprint retrospective, including here's Inspector Murmur from 13 O'Clock. And Maniac Killer Strikes Again, Delicious Mysterious Stories by Richard Sala, is a terrific introduction to his earliest stories. You've got 13 O'Clock and the Diabolical Dr. Q, both of which we saw in the 13 O'Clock Dark Horse comic, this time reformatted for these square pages, so they've got 4 panels instead of the 6 that the longer comic book had, and I think it works fantastically in this new format. And this book also contains The End of the Street, full of mysterious and supernatural goings-on, The 13 Fingers, whose 2 panels diagonal format works really well in this square book, and The Awful Secret of Dr. Coffin. These early stories are absolutely delightful, being as jammed as they are with ideas and art. Oh, I forgot about The Keepsake, equally grotesque and charming. And Judy Drood, Girl Detective, a sort of Nancy Drew take, although very different in character from Nancy Drew. And Judy Drood would go on to appear in a couple more Richard Sala stories, including one that I haven't read but know of. Since so many of these earlier stories, including 13 O'Clock, are quite hard to get your hands on, Maniac Killer Strikes Again is the perfect way to pick up almost all of Richard Sala's early work. And although Fantagraphics published that collection, Richard Sala actually returned to comics with Fantagraphics' anthology 00, which I have some issues of, but not all, that contain his story, The Chuckling Whatsit, which started with 00 number 2 and then ran for 12 consecutive issues, I think. 00 is a fantastic anthology, including comics by Spain, Mac White, David Mazzucchelli, Frank Stack, David Collier, Max Anderson in issue 2. This one over here from July 95 again contains stories by Collier, Williamson, Newgarden, Stack, Anderson, and of course continuing Richard Sala's story, The Chuckling Whatsit. The Chuckling Whatsit is probably his most twisting and complex story, with 2 or 3 people in pursuit of a MacGuffin, and the multiple part serialization must have been terrific to read back in the days when this was being first published in these and other issues. I think I have about 6 or 7 of the 12, or maybe it was even longer, series that ran in 00, but because I couldn't get all of them, I picked up the collected edition of The Chuckling Whatsit brought out by Fantagraphics, which has the full story in there in wonderful paper and very good production. I think all of these books that I've been showing, The Chuckling Whatsit and Maniac Killer Strikes Again, as well as a couple of other ones that I'll show, are out of print, but I've seen that they're still available secondhand, ex-library copies in the United States at least. But I also maintain hope that Fantagraphics will bring out reprints of them, maybe in nice hardcover editions. I mean, I can't think of anyone who deserves it more than Richard Sala. This is probably Richard Sala's longest story, and it's an absolute blast from beginning to finish. After 00, Richard Sala had another anthology with Fantagraphics, Evil Eye, and unlike 00, Evil Eye was all Richard Sala. So I think every issue of Evil Eye contained 1 part Reflection in a Glass Scorpion, which was a continuing serialized story moving from issue to issue with cliffhangers at the end. So it would end with a to be continued, and 1 part of the comic was Peculia, which was standalone stories about his delightful character Peculia, a very strange but self-assured girl who lived in a mansion in the forest and had all kinds of strange adventures. Peculia is the character who shows up on the cover of every issue of Evil Eye, and among the many things to love about this series are the inside, front, and back covers of Evil Eye are also Richard Sala, often promoting his work. Here's some letters to the editor, original art for sale advertised, previous issues of Evil Eye, as well as ads for The Chuckling Whatsit. And the back covers were also delightful illustrations, some of which were made into prints and posters available from Richard Sala's website. This little 4-panel cartoony Peculia poster was, I know, something he provided free to people who purchased art from him. Reflection in a Glass Scorpion and the stories of Peculia continued for 12 issues, and unlike 00, which I couldn't pick up every copy of, I've been lucky to get my hands on every copy of Evil Eyes. With their wonderful color covers and terrific black and white art inside, they're just fantastic comics. This is Evil Eye number 3, Evil Eye number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, maybe my favorite cover, number 8, number 9, number 10, number 11, and number 12. Reflections in a Glass Scorpion was collected together as the book Mad Night, and that story features Detective Judy Drood. I don't know why Glass Scorpion was renamed Mad Night, but Mad Night is also a very long and complex story like the Chuckling Whatsit. In fact, I'm not sure which one is longer. I think now that I think about it, Mad Night might be a couple of pages longer than the Chuckling Whatsit. A terrific and haunting mystery collected from the pages of Evil Eye. And the Peculia stories in Evil Eye, from Evil Eye 1 through 10, were collected in the collected edition of Peculia, which reads together as a collection of short stories that form a novel, like a story cycle, and also has 9 covers in the back. And the Peculia stories from issues 11 and 12 actually make up a complete story, Peculia and the Groon Grove Vampires, which was collected together by Fantagraphics as a graphic novel. Peculia and the Groon Grove Vampires is a slightly smaller format than Peculia and the original issues, but the formatting and the design is so well done that it remains an absolute blast to read, and you don't really miss anything from the larger size. If you're looking to start Richard Sala, I think Peculia and the Groon Grove Vampires are a terrific place to do so. Unless you choose to start with Delphine, probably his most polished, accomplished, mature work, or the one that he's most famous for, certainly the one that introduced me to Richard Sala. I've talked about Delphine at length in a couple of my other videos, but it's a brilliant take on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but told from the point of view of the Prince Charming character in a sort of contemporary setting, because he's following a girl that he used to know and date in college, whom he hasn't seen in many years, and trying to find out what happened to her by traveling to her home country, which is this peculiar Transylvania type of region in which a lot of weird and inexplicable things are going on, much like a lot of Richard Sala. But this art style, you can see, has developed into a polished, painterly sort of approach. And this book is truly beautiful in this collected hardcover or the paperback edition, but specifically in these original, larger sized Ignatz editions. I'd never heard of the Ignatz editions from Fantagraphics and Coco Nino Press before picking up Delphine, but these large paperback books are actually dust jacketed. With this inside magazine and this large jacket being a very unique sort of format that I've never seen before. There's a little flyer here that told me about more Ignatz series from Fantagraphics, including new tales from Old Palomar set in the Love and Rockets universe of Gilbert Hernandez, as well as comics by Kevin Huizenga and many others that are probably material for a different video. Delphine was originally published in 4 of these issues, and this large format is perhaps the most perfect way of representing Richard Sala's art that I've seen. This is issue 1, this is issue 2, this is issue 3, and issue 4. I think they're a little hard to track down, but if you can, I would highly recommend trying to get your hands on these 4 issues of Delphine. These 3 books might be easier to get your hands on. These aren't the most recent of Richard Sala's works. There are a couple that I'm missing, but Cat Burglar Black from First Second Comics is an all-ages, very interesting story about a girl who's trying to find out about her father and comes to this school, which is actually a school for cat burglars, and then starts discovering or uncovering all kinds of different secrets. Again, a familiar trope for Richard Sala stories, done in an absolutely enjoyable tongue-in-cheek tone. It's got wonderful drawings, beautiful colors, one of my favorite Richard Sala comics. Very odd, very alluring, and it'll leave you wanting more at the end. In a Glass Grotesquely is a collection of stories including super enigmatics about a supervillain who is responsible for all of the evil in the world. It will be all over before you know it. Stranger Street and the prestigious banquet to be held in my honor, which I think is from Drawn and Quarterly. Of course, of the 129 pages, 117 pages are super enigmatics, which is really what this book is mainly comprising. It seems gloriously campy, but actually has quite a lot of commentary about our world today. And then you've got these spectacular black and white, older illustrations. The inside back cover of In a Glass Grotesquely is one of my favorite illustrations by Richard Sala. Although, as you can tell by now, almost everything he does is one of my favorites. The Hidden is another Fantagraphics hardcover, which is one long story. It's a surprisingly creepy and violent story and packs quite a punch, including a twist ending. This hardcover is in terrific shape, but it's a used ex-library copy, and I found out after I'd ordered it that it's from the Oak Park Public Library. Oak Park being the neighborhood in which I visit one of my favorite bookstores, on which I've made a video as well. What a coincidence. So The Hidden, In a Glass Grotesquely, and Cat Burglar Black are, again, three excellent places to start reading Richard Sala if you're interested, and probably more easily available than some of the other books that we've looked at. And finally, let me adjust this a little. And finally, it was a dark and silly night. Little Lit Comics for Kids, edited by Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly. The title story in this terrific book for children. The first story in this collection, which includes works by Tony Millionaire, Neil Gaiman and Gahan Wilson, William Joyce, Basil Wolverton, Just Swart, Kaz, Barbara McClintock, is by Lemony Snicket and Richard Sala. Written by Lemony Snicket, but drawn, colored, and lettered by Richard Sala. A wonderful story about the abominable snowman. This is the only collaboration of Richard Sala's I know, and Lemony Snicket and him make a perfect pairing. This is a lovely, oversized hardcover book, and along with everything else, I hope provides a lot of opportunity to introduce yourself to the wonderful world of Richard Sala.